Hello class, my name is Mrs. Woofenden and today we are going to learn about the neuroanatomical pathways responsible for the task of answering a simple math equation. Simple here meaning a math question that would be considered a fact by about upper elementary level. We are going to take a journey through 3 examples to help demonstrate. 1. A student who has their basic facts memorized. 2. A student who needs to calculate their basic facts. And 3. A student learning to go from calculation to memorization. In our first scenario, we will explore a student who can answer a question such as 6 times 2 almost automatically, without much thinking. Multiplication is usually associated with overlearned verbal reciting of the times tables, which then creates a memorized fact. Simple, single-digit addition without regrouping of the tens place is also often memorized and retrieved in the same manner we will discuss in this first scenario. Interestingly, retrieval of an answer that has been memorized, called rote memory, is almost completely facilitated unilaterally by the left hemisphere of the brain. We are going to start at the very beginning. The first thing that needs to happen in answering a simple math equation is visual input needs to get into the brain. The written question passes through the eye's pupils to become flipped on the back of the retina. From here, the image is transformed into electrical signals and sent via optic nerves to the brain for processing. These signals are sent both ipsilaterally and contralaterally through the optic chiasm. So everything seen in the right field of vision in both eyes ends up in the left occipital lobe and vice versa. There is a short pit stop in the lateral geniculate nucleus of the thalamus, located in the medial region of both cerebral hemispheres. This is where raw visual afferent or input information is organized before radiating out to the appropriate regions in the primary visual cortex of the occipital lobe. From the medial or middle presentation of the left hemisphere, we can see here, the primary visual cortex is in the most posterior position on the occipital lobe. This region is often referred to as Brodmann Area 17 and is responsible for the initial processing of light, colors, and motion that prime the signals for identification in subsequent areas. Next, the afferent input visual information passes into Brodmann Area 18 in the secondary visual cortex for recognition of numbers and symbols. This recognition of numbers supports the supramarginal gyrus that we will discuss next as part of the dorsal stream. In order to best visualize this, see what I did there? Visualize. We are going to look at the brain even more closely at the lateral or outside perspective of the brain, as shown in this picture. The dorsal stream is largely responsible for the perception of where things are, and follows a superior anterior direction along the parietal and frontal lobes. The dorsal stream takes a relatively minor role during rote memory retrieval. Visual information from the occipital lobe takes a ride into the inferior parietal areas along the cingulate bundle. This is a collection of white matter nerve axon connections that allows for fast-track interpretation of signals in the following lobules. Found in the lateral parietal lobe, the angular gyrus mainly acts as a circuit breaker. It makes a split-second decision which parts of the brain need to be engaged to complete the task at hand. During rote memory retrieval tasks, the angular gyrus suppresses the activation of the calculation route using inhibitory GABA neurons sent to the retrosplenial cortex, found here in the medial inferior parietal lobe. This encourages a default mode. The default mode network is most associated with a resting state. However, it is also the primary location for automatic cognitive responses, like overly learned math skills. Another stop along the dorsal stream highway is the supramarginal gyrus, found just anterior to the angular gyrus, and is responsible for mentally changing numbers into words, just like phonologically reading the math expression out loud. 6 times 2. This mental reiteration of the math skill sentence will begin the verbal sequence completion route that we will discuss next. The dorsal stream plays a more significant role when a simple math fact needs to be calculated. We will discuss this in the next scenario. Now that the brain recognizes the numbers and has converted it into mental words, it is time for rote memory retrieval. The retrosplenial cortex sends inhibitory GABA signals to activate the default mode network. The first area involved is the basal ganglia, found in the medial cavity of the cortex. During rote memory retrieval, the basal ganglia is largely responsible for habitual cause and effect thinking. With the help of the hippocampus, which stores long-term memory, the basal ganglia is where the recognized math equation 6 times 2 is verbally completed as 6 times 2 is 12. It is extremely important to note that 6 times 2 is 12. The brain is not calculating this answer, it just recognizes the sequence of the math equation and equates that sentence with the number 12 as the answer. This is a key feature of rote memory retrieval and is also why learning the basic facts makes more complex math easier in the future. The finalized verbal equation is then sent back into the retrosplenial cortex, completing a neural loop. The cortical, basal ganglia, hippocampal, cortical loop to retrieve the memorized fact. From the retrosplenial cortex, the answered math facts travel along the ventral stream to begin the process of verbalizing the answer. The ventral stream follows mostly along the lateral temporal lobe and is a highway for an automatic identification of what something is. Visual information from the occipital lobe takes a ride along the fronto-occipital vesicles via a collection of white matter connections called the external extreme capsule system. Along the superior temporal gyrus, the completed verbal math equation is comprehended in Wernicke's area. The ventral stream then takes the understood verbal signals along the arcuate vesicles into Broca's area, the frontal lobe, to begin the formation of speech. Broca's area, found in the inferior frontal lobe, organizes the inflection and articulation of how the verbal answer will sound. This is an intermediary stop before the processed speech goes through the secondary motor cortex to the primary motor cortex. The primary motor cortex is often showed to be organized as body parts sized appropriately to the neural regions dedicated to activating them. This is called the motor homunculus. The efferent, or output muscle groups relevant to verbal responding are in the face, mouth, and tongue. Motor signals travel out of the brain and activate the necessary areas in the peripheral nervous system to say the answer 12. All of these neural pathways happen almost instantaneously for someone who has their basic facts memorized to retrieve the answer from their rote memory. Now class, in this second scenario, we will explore the differences in the brain for a student who needs to calculate the basic facts. This example may represent a student with a learning delay. However, it is also commonly seen as the main route for answering subtraction, such as 8 minus 3, and division questions, as these are usually not learned through drilled facts like addition and multiplication. Unlike rote memory retrieval, math calculation requires activation in both hemispheres of the brain for number magnitude and visuospatial understanding. First, visual input travels along the optic nerves and through the thalamus. Signals arrive in the primary motor cortex of the occipital lobe. The secondary visual cortex helps to recognize the numbers before signals are sent through the dorsal and ventral streams. Along the dorsal stream into the posterior parietal lobe, the supramarginal gyrus reads the math equation phonologically, 8 minus 3. Furthermore, the angular gyrus recognizes this answer is not in rote memory. Therefore, Excitatory glutamate neurons are sent along the intraparietal sulcus for activation of the calculation route. In order to fully comprehend the calculation route, we must take a look at both hemispheres of the brain. From the coronal, or top view of the brain seen here, we can analyze how math equations are calculated using bilateral communication in the brain. This is the most notable difference between rote memory retrieval and calculation learning. The left intraparietal sulcus communicates via the corpus callosum with the right intraparietal sulcus. The left side is largely responsible for numerical representation, while the right side comprehends more spatial understanding. This communication between both sulci allows for the mental magnitude and estimation of what each number actually represents. The bilateral intraparietal sulci help to create a mental number line to allow for counting. In the present scenario, and is often common in subtraction, even into adulthood, the mind would begin at 8 and would count backwards 3 times to arrive at the final answer 5. It is important to note that a mental number line is but one example of a strategy for how the brain calculates a math equation. Depending on how someone learns, their brain may show mental numerical spatial representations to calculate the answer in different ways, such as crossing out blocks. From here, the calculated answer returns into the Perry-Sullivan language areas via the ventral stream of the left hemisphere. Calculated answers follow along the left hemispheric Perry-Sullivan language cortex we discussed as part of the ventral stream for rote memory retrieval, through Wernicke's area to arrive at Broca's area. From Broca's area, motor activity is chosen in the secondary motor cortex before the primary motor cortex signals the body via the peripheral nervous system into the action of answering the math question. Although this process can take a bit longer and uses more working memory processing, a calculation pathway can determine a correct answer. In our third scenario, we are going to explore the main strategies involved in helping a student learn how to get from relying on the calculation rote to activating rote memory for retrieval of a simple math equation. Let's use the example 5 plus 4. There are two main strategies that have been identified as best teaching practices: drill training and concept training. Drill training consists of repetition, often through verbal recitation of facts. However, it may also be from repetitive homework practice questions or even hobby puzzle activities. Drill training strategies can be useful for memorization of simple facts, but they are less transferable for larger math concepts. Drill training activates more of the left angular gyrus and Perry-Sullivan language pathways, which help to encode verbal repetition into long-term memory. On the other hand, concept training includes learning strategies about how to find the answer. It is not just about memorization, but understanding the equation, how the numbers relate to each other, and how to get the solution. One way we can do this is with number lines. We can use a number line to help us count along or utilize skip counting techniques. Another great tool is base 10 blocks or other similar manipulatives to help students be physically involved in math. Students often also use finger tapping techniques, although forming a habit of using finger tapping can actually interfere with rote memory retrieval. The location of finger movements in the somatosensory cortex is very close to the supramarginal gyrus that changes numbers into words, both located in the parietal lobe. This slows the whole process and may even prevent retrieval. Instead, signals are sent through the calculation route. Finger counting is less interruptive if counting begins on the left hand, because that is processed contralaterally in the right hemisphere. However, what works even better is counting using foot stomping, which is located further away from the retrieval route. Concept training strategies are excellent for transferability to new or similar equations. However, this method utilizes more working memory, which may be difficult for students. especially those that are cognitively delayed. Let's take a final review of the different learning pathways involved in rote memory versus calculation. To conclude our lesson today, let's take a look side by side at the differences and similarities between rote memory and calculation pathways. Afferent or input visual pathways are the same until we get to the angular gyrus, which is seen here as the orange circle. This is the point when the brain chooses to access rote memory through a cortical loop or a calculation processing route through bilateral intraparietal sulci communication. Regardless of the route taken, once the answer has been achieved, the efferent or output of the auditory answer is the same. In conclusion, anything can be learned to be memorized and can eventually become imprinted in rote memory. Both drill training and concept training can result in rote memory storage and future retrieval. However, like any teaching strategy, it is important to be mindful of the students you have in your class before choosing. Drill training can be better at activating fast fact retrieval. It can also get repetitive and boring and is less likely to be transferable to new concepts. Moreover, concept training allows for transferability due to the depth of understanding, but it can also become a reliant strategy, and some students may never transition to memorization. It is also more mentally taxing on working memory. Thank you for attending today's class on answering a simple math equation.